June 6, 1944, Omaha Beach, 00:15 a.m. In bunker WN62, Hinrich So finished cleaning the barrel of his MG42 with the calm of someone who believed he controlled destiny. In his uniform pocket, a letter from his fiancée promised to wait for him until Germany's final victory. Hours earlier, Field Marshal Rommel had inspected that position, looked at the overlapping firing range, and said with conviction, "This beach will be the tomb of the invasion," they believed. Every meter of the Norman coast had been fortified with concrete mines and steel. Each commander repeated the doctrine, any force that landed there would be crushed in the first few hours. But that early morning did not bring an attack. It brought an event for which the German army had no doctrine, no ammunition, no imagination. This video reconstructs D-Day from the perspective of someone who prepared to fight soldiers and faced a production chain. A machine that manufactured supplies, gliders, ships, tanks, and replacements as accurately as a German rifleman counted his last cartridges. They swore to throw the Allies back into the sea. Instead, they sank under the weight of what they never understood, American industrial supremacy. But before we dive into the data, there's one statistic that defines this story better than any image or speech. In the space of a few hours, 6,139 vessels, from battleships to supply ferries, would appear from the fog in front of Normandy. A force so vast that a German gunner would fire 13,500 rounds in a single day. And yet, it would not be able to contain even the first cycle of boosters. Germany believed it was facing soldiers. But, without realizing it, he was facing Fordism, the assembly line. The enemy manufactured war as one manufactured cars. If you value this type of detailed historical reconstruction, consider supporting the channel with your subscription and a like. This helps us continue to investigate what really happened, behind the trenches and the myths. On the night of June 5, 1944, as the English Channel roared with winds of up to 25 knots and waves of almost 2 meters, German officers slept peacefully under the certainty that nothing would happen. In Paris, Luftwaffe meteorologist Walter Stumpf had assured the High Command that weather conditions made any invasion impossible for at least 2 weeks. Naval patrols were suspended, radars operated with less attention, and the front line remained under the command of lower-ranking officers. The generals had been cleared for war games in Rennes. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, a symbol of German rigidity and tactical instinct, left for Germany with a pair of suede shoes for his wife's birthday. Nothing, absolutely nothing, indicated concern. The Atlantic Wall, with its 17 million cubic meters of concrete and 1.2 million tons of steel, was seen as impassable. More than 6.5 million mines were planted along the beaches of occupied France, covering accesses, paths, and possible landing zones. German propaganda repeated to exhaustion, "If the Allies come, they will be decimated before they even touch the ground." On the Normandy coast, confidence translated into routine. Soldiers like Hinrich So maintained their weapons, wrote letters, and planned the next rotation in the rear. The defensive positions at Omaha Beach sounded infallible. There were 8 bunkers, 35 pillboxes, 18 anti-tank guns, 85 machine gun nests, and thousands of obstacles prepared in the tidal zone. But on the other side of the ocean, in an American operations room, the logic of war was already different. While the Germans relied on weather and mines, the Allies relied on data, satellites, weather flights over the North Atlantic, and stations in places where the Germans didn't even know there was life, like Greenland. These sources identified a narrow window of only 36 hours in which weather conditions would allow for a bold attack. Eisenhower did not hesitate. At 4:15 a.m. on the 5th, the order was given. The largest maritime invasion in human history was underway. As the Germans celebrated anniversaries, more than 150,000 men boarded ships. More than 2,200 aircraft were already flying over England in combat formation. It was an operation based not on hope, but on numbers. An operation that challenged the German belief that war was decided only by courage, position, and armor. In the minds of Rommel and much of the Nazi high command, Germany still controlled time, geography, and narrative. The storm that roared over the canal was interpreted as a natural shield, not as a perfect curtain to cover the enemy's advance. The problem is that this enemy did not believe in myths. The American war machine had learned to control the weather with sensors, the sea with floating ports, and the sky with B-24 bombers leaving the factory every 63 minutes. Yes, you heard that right. Every 63 minutes, a new aircraft was completed at the Willow Run plant. Germany has never reached this pace, not even close. For every German plane shot down, the United States produced 5. For every Panzer tank, the Allies delivered 10 Shermans. If this comparison impresses you, comment below with the phrase that best sums up this shock. Absolute power, logistics wins, or simply shocking data. The truth is that June 6th did not begin with gunfire. It began with absence. Absence of vigilance, absence of command, absence of doubt. The German generals were physically and mentally absent. They didn't know they were about to face not just an enemy, but an equation. Every ton of steel cast in Detroit meant one less trench for Germany. Every cargo unloaded in England was a mined position that would lose meaning. The German soldiers who looked at the sea that night saw nothing, and that was what comforted them. The absence of movement was interpreted as a sign that everything was under control. But the ships were already moving, the paratroopers were already taking off, and calculations about the defensive capacity of the Atlantic Wall, made with arithmetic precision by officers like Colonel Ernst Goth, were beginning to become irrelevant. The equation he designed to defend Normandy assumed something that reality does not forgive: the existence of infinite ammunition and static conditions. And while German doctrine still relied on the rigidity of fixed positions, American logic was already working with mobility, superposition, and substitution at scale. When the first German radar detected an unusual signal at about 11:15 p.m., the operators laughed. These are distraction maneuvers, as always, but this time it wasn't. And at the end of that morning, as German radars flashed erratically, a report quietly reached the command of the German Army's 7th Division. Paratroopers had been sighted at different points in Normandy. At first it seemed impossible, afterwards it seemed like a mistake, soon after it seemed like confusion, and finally it was true. They were surrounded by an enemy they did not see coming, and they had no way to go back. In the next few minutes, one of the most lucid figures in the Nazi High Command would record the beginning of the collapse. Major Hans von Luck, Armored Regiment commander of the 21st Panzer Division, would say, "At that moment I understood that the war was lost, not for a mistake, but because we had faced the future with doctrines of the past." But what exactly were the Germans about to see when dawn came? What kind of force could break through that wall considered insurmountable? The answer was not in tanks or tactics, it was in proportions, and they would appear with the first light. At 11:15 p.m. on June 5th, German radar stations Freya and Würzburg began picking up unusual signals coming from the north. Successive waves of reflected echoes indicated large-scale aerial formations crossing the channel. The operators, trained to analyze profiles and frequencies, recorded the data accurately, but when they transmitted the reports, they were met with skepticism and, in some cases, disdain. For the High Command, that was another Allied exercise in disinformation. The British had used this type of tactic several times: radar reflectors mounted on ghost planes, false transmissions, electronic deception operations. The pattern was repeated, and so was the German response. The information was classified as typical simulation activity. The alarm did not sound, but across the channel, Operation Titanic was underway. Hundreds of parachute dummies, nicknamed Rupert by the British, were dropped into areas off the coast to simulate mass landings. Equipped with sound devices and light explosives, they mimicked battles and tactical movements. The confusion was instantaneous. Some German units reported paratroopers to the north, others to the south. None could confirm the identity of the attackers. Meanwhile, the real paratroopers of the American 101st and 82nd Divisions and the British 6th Airborne Division were landing quietly behind enemy lines, cutting off roads, sabotaging lines of communication, and marking strategic points for advancing troops. German doctrine, structured on hierarchical rigidity and waiting for orders from above, froze. Entire divisions waited for permission to react. Hans von Luck, who commanded an armored unit key to coastal defense, asked for authorization to immediately attack the landing points. His division's response was straightforward: wait for clarity of the situation. In his memoirs, von Luck wrote, "At that moment I realized that we had been defeated from within. Indecision cost the reaction, and every minute we waited was a kilometer gained by the Allies." What the radar stations saw that night was not a gimmick. It was the harbinger of the largest amphibious invasion in military history. But the German intelligence system, stifled by its own mistrust, ignored its own warning. The technical irony was brutal. Germany had one of the most advanced radar networks in the world, but it no longer believed in it. The excess of previous simulations had eroded confidence in what was real, and the enemy knew how to exploit this weakness with surgical precision. By the time the actual data was finally taken seriously, it was too late. The skies over Normandy were filling with aircraft. On the ground, elite units such as the 6th Fallschirmjäger Regiment received contradictory information. Some reports spoke of Canadian troops, others of British, and still others of American units already established in the interior. There was no reliable center of analysis. Communication, dependent on cables and radios without mobility, was fragmented. And unlike the Allies, who operated with redundant air, land, and naval coordination systems, the Germans relied on a vertical chain of command that, in the chaos of that early morning, simply disappeared. The first Allied victory in Normandy was not won by gunfire. It was won by confusion, and the failure was not one of technology, but of doctrine. The signals were picked up, the reports were issued, the maps showed what was to come, but the mind that commanded did not accept reality. The invasion that had been rehearsed for months was finally underway, and who should see it first chose to ignore it. The price of this mistake would begin to be paid in the early hours of the morning, when the first German observers spotted a black line on the horizon, a line that stretched from east to west, from sea to sky. They were not shadows nor hallucinations. They were ships, thousands of them. The Allied fleet was already within visual range. But what was not yet within the reach of understanding was the scale of this armada. The question that hovered among observers on the German coast was no longer, will they come, but rather, how is something like this possible? The answer would come minutes later, measured in tons, calibers, and explosions, and once it started, there would be no more retreat. Since 1942, the German High Command had invested in the construction of the so-called Atlantic Wall, a defensive line of more than 2,400 kilometers running from Norway to the border of Spain, designed to prevent any invasion attempt from the west. It was a colossal effort of military engineering, fueled by propaganda, resources diverted from the Eastern Front, and the belief that static power still decided wars. The Normandy coast, in particular, was treated as a priority. At Omaha Beach, where the narrow terrain between the sea and the cliffs formed natural bottlenecks, defensive positions were designed to generate overlapping fire, zones where any enemy soldier would simultaneously be within range of multiple automatic weapons and artillery pieces. Colonel Ernst Goth, commander of the 916th Grenadier Regiment, coolly calculated that his guns could deliver about 120 rounds per minute per sector, with the ability to repel any landings before the enemy infantry even reached the dry sand line. The heavy artillery was positioned in places reinforced by reinforced concrete, disguised among vegetation and small natural elevations. There were 4 main batteries, all interconnected by underground corridors, and with enough ammunition reserves, according to the plan, for at least 2 days of intense combat. The positions also had 85 MG-42 machine gun nests, 6 mortar pits, 18 anti-tank guns, and 45 rocket launch sites. The beach had been turned into a calculated slaughter zone. At sea, the tidal zone was transformed into a floating minefield. 3,700 obstacles were driven at precise angles, between Czech hedgehogs, Belgian gates, and stakes with box mines, all meticulously designed to capsize vessels, break hulls, and force uncovered landings. The enemy, in the German view, would be forced to descend far from the coast, cross the raging sea on foot, and be annihilated under crossfire before reaching any cover. The doctrine that supported this apparatus was clear: prevent the beachhead. Any failure there in the first few hours would be irrecoverable. Therefore, it was believed that the first shots would decide the fate of the invasion. But behind the German engineering and precision, there was a silent and devastating error. All calculations were based on one assumption: continuous availability of ammunition. Reserves were stored for a brief and efficient engagement based on the doctrine of destructive defense. The plan called for massive shootings, but with limited duration. No one, absolutely no one, considered the hypothesis of an enemy capable of absorbing losses, replenishing forces in real time, and continuing the attack for days without interruption. Germany was planning a battle of static resistance against an adversary that brought with it not only troops, but ports, depots, factories, and cranes. This failure of strategic vision was about to be brutally exposed. When the first Allied troops set foot in the sand of Omaha, the defenders opened fire accurately and effectively. MG-42 machine guns cut through the spaces between obstacles like blades. The 50mm and 75mm guns cratered between the landings. The first waves were in fact massacred, but then came the second, then the third. And then the ships retreated to make room for floating tanks, supply barges, engineers, radios, cables, excavators. The logistical timer had been set, and the Allies operated under a model that did not provide for interruption. While German warehouses emptied, Allied support vessels delivered reinforcements every half hour. Allied radios worked in a network. The ammunition came in continuous flow. The doctrine of immediate annihilation proved ineffective against a structure capable of absorbing losses and continuing to operate. The invading force was not a force. It was a system. In a report issued after the war, General Hans Speidel, who served as Rommel's chief of staff, wrote, "The greatest failure was not in the cement, nor in the steel. It was in the calculation. We believed that the enemy had a limit. They didn't. They had reservations." While German gunners rationed grenades for fear of depletion, the Allies had stockpiled more than 600,000 tons of ammunition in mobile depots, distributed among supply ships, floating convoys, and future logistics areas on French soil. German firepower, impressive in its early hours, was a match against a refinery. The belief in the inviolable collapsed in the face of infinite replacement. An MG-42 firing at 1,200 rounds per minute was formidable, until tape was missing. A 75mm anti-tank gun could stop tanks until it lost its magazines, and yet when German soldiers looked back for reinforcements, they saw empty roads. Any attempt at transport was intercepted by Allied aviation or the French resistance. Every piece of German defense that fell silent was not replaced, and what was once a fortress became a ruin. The bunkers had no air conditioning, no regeneration. They were slow tombs, and all this was predicted by the Allies. Not by intuition, but by calculations. The landing at Omaha Beach was planned with German resistance in mind as inevitable. The plan was not to win in hours, it was winning by persistence. The force was not in the first attack, but in the 20th. And when the German commanders realized that the tide was not receding, they understood too late. They were fighting a production line. But what happens when even the best-positioned bunkers begin to give way, and when the defenders themselves realize that their weapons have no more ammunition, no visible targets, just waves that keep coming? The answer lies in the vision of a German observer, who at dawn saw the entire horizon covered by ships, and he said, "The whole world is landing here." He did not yet know that the ships were only the surface. The real power was in what would come from above. At 5:30 a.m., when the first grey light broke through the fog of the English Channel, the German observers in elevated positions adjusted their spotting scopes, expecting to see the rough and empty sea, as in the previous days. What they saw, however, defied any doctrine. From the horizon to the shore, the sea was covered, not with waves, but with metal. Not dozens, not hundreds, but thousands of vessels advanced in coordinated formation. Battleships, destroyers, troop transports, supply ships, landing craft, tugboats, a lively and organized mass of floating steel. An artillery officer in WN-62 reportedly said in a low, almost breathless voice, "The whole world has come at us." The Allied armada totaled 6,739 ships, the largest naval force ever assembled in human history. The fleet didn't just dominate the sea, it dissolved the very concept of the battlefront. There was no disembarkation point. There was a floating continent in motion, with enough strength and depth to reconfigure the entire military geography of the region. At 5:35 a.m., the first shots were fired. The battleship USS Texas began a bombardment over the cliffs of Pointe du Hoc. In 34 minutes, the ship would fire 255 14-inch shells, with accuracy adjusted by aerial observers. HMS Warspite, positioned to the east, opened simultaneous fire on German coastal positions, unloading full days' worth of ground ammunition in less than an hour. The ongoing naval bombardment did not resemble any previous experience of the German defenders. In the words of one survivor, the bunkers swayed as if they were on water. Reinforced concrete structures, built to withstand field artillery, began to crack under the impact of naval shells. Many soldiers died buried alive. Others were buried, dug up and buried again as the waves of fire alternated. It was systemic destruction, time to dismantle positions, silence batteries, and disorganize the entire line of command. The radios began to fail. Evacuation routes disappeared. The craters were so deep that they prevented even ambulances from moving. Germany had prepared a fortress, but it had not anticipated that the enemy could simply demolish the fortress in hours. The Allied naval artillery operated with industrial doctrine, rapid replenishment, continuous cadence, coordination with planes and infantry. It was artillery integrated into a complete warfare system, which included logistics, engineering, and aiming technology. Each shot had a motive, a target, a function within the whole. The Germans, however well prepared, acted like isolated islands. Local commanders counted supplies, vulnerable communication. The observation towers fell one by one. The command points were hit in the first salvos. German firepower was not eliminated all at once, it was dismantled. And what the German soldiers felt was not just fear, it was disorientation. Many had never faced a real fleet. Most had never fought with heavy naval artillery. The roar of gunfire echoed through the bones. The explosions didn't just destroy, they displaced air, they displaced time. Some soldiers believed they were facing aerial bombardments. Such was the force. The irony of this story is that the solution was in front of them. It was in the range of vision, on the radar, in the reports of the early morning, but they chose not to believe it. They underestimated the size, courage, and above all, the enemy's ability to replace. And now every second brought not only bombs but also an engineering lesson. If you're enjoying unraveling these facts, how the largest armada ever built was ignored until it was less than 10 kilometers from the beach, show your support, like and subscribe, so we can continue to bring you these reconstructions in detail. Because what is about to happen, no one on that beach had predicted, not even the men who calculated the perfect defense. For as the ships fired from the sea, something much quieter and more lethal was already coming from the sky. Heinrich So pulled the trigger at 06:35. The MG-42 roared with the fury for which it had been designed. 200 rounds per minute, short bursts, each claiming lives as they rushed through the sand. Bunker WN-62 was still functional, miraculously spared by naval bombardment. Their firing ranges covered most of Omaha Beach, as in a perfect exercise in military geometry. And there, under the cracked concrete, Xiao became a high-precision cog in a machine that, for a moment, worked as planned. In 9 hours of non-stop combat, he would fire 13,500 shells. The barrel of the gun would deform from the heat. The surrounding floor would become a carpet of empty cartridges. It was the ultimate application of individual tactical power. But outside, the sea ignored his effort. For every group of soldiers that fell on the beach, another LCVP was already approaching. For each vessel destroyed, 5 replacements were launched from the mother vessels to the bottom of the armada. The Americans operated with programmed redundancy. Each assault squad came with reserves, each medical unit with double stocks. Each commander had twice as many radios, maps, coordinates, and ammunition. If an officer died, the replacement took over with the same plan, the same doctrine, and the same resources. Allied logistics were designed to maintain the offensive even under heavy losses, and these losses were foreseen. From the German point of view, it was like fighting an enemy that did not bleed. Every death they caused seemed irrelevant. A German commander would later report, "It was like trying to stem the tide with bayonets." They were trapped in a linear logic, kill, advance, hold position, against an enemy that operated in exponential logic. The defenses of the Atlantic Wall worked as planned in the first few minutes. But soon, the mathematics of destruction was reversed. Every bunker that resisted was isolated, outflanked, suppressed by destroyer fire or amphibious tanks. Each machine gun nest that survived the initial bombardment was a priority target for combat engineering, flamethrowers, or shipborne artillery. The enemy had studied each position in surgical detail, aerial photographs, maps, simulations. When the Americans advanced, they did not do so out of bravery alone. They knew where they were stepping, and they knew what to find. Heinrich So, from his vantage point, watched the impossible happen. The beach not only resisted fire, it absorbed it. When he thought he had cleaned a sector, he reappeared. Just when he thought the advance had been halted, a new wave came from another flank. It was a continuous flow, which did not obey the natural cycle of combat. One of the Allied reports describes the D-Day logistical resupply with a precise phrase, "Every hour we were more than the previous one." In the rear, far from the line of fire, the American gear turned incessantly. LSTs, landing ship tank, dropped heavy armor. Trucks unloaded fuel, ammunition, radios, hot food. Logistics officers coordinated supply lines with clipboards and radios. Each bay, each piece of sand had a function. It was an invasion factory operating in real time. In contrast, the German defenders began to feel the first signs of collapse. Ammunition dwindling, radios failing, neighboring units disappearing from the network. Batteries that were supposed to operate for days exhausted their stocks within hours. Defense doctrine assumed that the Allies would retreat under initial losses, but when that didn't happen, no contingency had been prepared. The system began to break down. General Hans von Luck, commander of the 21st Panzer Division, upon receiving the first reports of the landing, requested authorization to counterattack. The response from the chain of command was a phrase that would be repeated throughout the day. Wait for more information. Every minute lost was another wave of enemy reinforcements consolidating position. Von Luck would later write, "We were watching the war move faster than our decision-making structure." And there was a silent aggravation, the total absence of the Luftwaffe. The air force that had promised superiority in any theater was absent. Of the hundreds of sorties planned, only 2 aircraft carried out an effective attack on the beaches on the morning of D-Day. 2 Focke-Wulf FW-190 fighters fired on Sword Beach and immediately retreated. The sky, which was to be defended, belonged to the Allies. The German machine was not only being outclassed, she was being dismantled while trying to operate. It was as if the Second World War at that moment had ceased to be a war between soldiers and had become a brutal experiment between 2 systems of production. On the one hand, the artisanal effort of the German resistance, made up of fixed positions, counted ammunition and fragmented orders. On the other, a coordinated network of factories, ships, planes and men trained to occupy, replace and repeat. One of the officers of the 716th Infantry Division would report after the war, "For every shot we fired, they fired 10. For each death, they sent 2 new ones. Within hours, I understood that our arithmetic was not compatible with theirs." And here's a figure that defines that discrepancy. In 1944, the United States was producing 96,000 aircraft a year. Germany produced just over 39,000. If this data surprised you, comment below. Logistics wins. As Hinrich So changed the barrel of his machine gun for the 3rd time and plunged his arms in sweat, soot and smoke, he did not know that at that very moment, more than 15,000 men were landing behind his line of fire, and thousands more were on the way. The sound of war was now continuous. There were no breaks, there was no retreat. By noon he had become a man surrounded by empty cartridges, unable to process the volume of defeat. He was still fighting, but he was no longer fighting. It was mechanical resistance without strategic sense, and as it fired, new shadows began to fall from the sky. But they weren't bombardments. They were gliders, and they brought something that would completely change the course of the battle. In the early morning hours of June 6th, while the Allied paratroopers were already cutting through the shadows behind the German lines, and the naval fleet was positioning itself in front of Normandy, the German defenders expected one thing: that the Luftwaffe would fulfill its promise. For months, commanders had assured that any attempted invasion would be sprayed from the sky. Propaganda posters showed squadrons of Messerschmitts in close flight, dropping bombs with precision on invading vessels. The imagination of the German air war was still dominated by the memory of 1940, when the Luftwaffe had shaken British soil. But at that dawn, none of this was repeated. The sky over Omaha, Utah, Sword, Gold, and Juneau belonged to another empire. At 0440 a.m., the first wave of P-47 Thunderbolt and P-51 Mustang fighters were already flying in circles over the Allied fleet. Above them, B-26 and B-17 bombers lined up for coordinated attacks against German positions in depth. Air cover was so dense that Allied pilots would report difficulty finding targets that had not yet been hit. The forward controllers, operating from boats and improvised coastal posts, directed the missions with real-time data based on field observations, mobile radars, and intercepted information from German communication. Meanwhile, on the German side, the tracks near Normandy remained almost silent. The Luftwaffe, devastated by years of attrition on the Eastern Front, Allied bombing, and fuel shortages, was unable to launch more than a few scattered missions. At 05:15, two Focke-Wulf FW-190 planes briefly surfaced over Sword Beach, carried out a machine gun attack and disappeared. No other significant attacks were recorded in the first few hours. No organized training, no coordinated bombing, no response. The absence was total, not only operational but symbolic. It was the denial of one of the pillars of modern warfare, the domination of the air. For German soldiers on the ground, it was like fighting homeless. Each Allied advance was accompanied by air cover. Every attempt at German reinforcement was intercepted by fighters. Trucks, light armor, and artillery convoys moving toward the front were destroyed before arriving. In all, the Allies would fly 14,674 air sorties on that single day. The Luftwaffe, less than 200, most of them in remote sectors or without practical effect. The ratio reached 70-1. German radios requesting air support received evasive answers, then silence. In some sectors, the silence of the sky was interpreted as a technical failure until reality imposed itself. The sky had changed owners. This Allied air supremacy was not the result of luck. It was a direct result of the industrial capacity of the United States and Great Britain. While Germany tried to keep its hangars camouflaged and rationed fuel, factories in Detroit and Manchester delivered dozens of fighters a day. The Inglewood, California plant alone produced more Mustangs per month than the entire Luftwaffe could operate that summer. And it wasn't just quantity, it was also integration. The Allied planes operated with interconnected communication networks. Pilots could receive tactical updates during flight, adjust routes, receive coordinates of targets with an accuracy of seconds. Air warfare had become an extension of ground logistics. On the German side, the perception of the collapse intensified. Officers began to use terms such as abandonment, disappearance, and broken illusion to describe the absence of the Luftwaffe. General Friedrich Dollmann, commander of the 7th Army, would report in his war diary that heaven belongs to them, and without heaven, we have nothing left but to resist by inertia. The absence of the Luftwaffe had a devastating effect on morale. The troops on land, already pressured by the avalanche advancing from the sea, felt isolated. Defense doctrine, which relied on air counterattacks to relieve pressure on critical points, simply ceased to function. A plan without execution, and the Allies knew how to exploit this advantage. In the first 24 hours, Allied planes destroyed 80 bridges, 254 vehicles, and disabled 35 railway lines. The German logistical flow was strangled. Reinforcements were not enough. Units did not communicate. Heaven had become an absolute weapon, invisible, continuous, and relentless. The Allied air presence was so dominant that even naval forces operated without risk. The battleships, which in any other scenario would have been primary targets for bombardment, bombed with impunity for hours. The transport fleet operated with lights on at night. It was an unthinkable scenario in the early years of the war, now reality. In his final report on D-Day, General Dwight D. Eisenhower would write, "Without air supremacy, no plan would survive. With it, even mistakes can be absorbed." It was the recognition that control of the sky doesn't just protect, it sets the pace of war. The Luftwaffe, once the symbol of air terror, had been reduced to impotence by an equation it could not solve: scale production, logistical integration, and territorial control. It was not enough to have pilots. It was necessary to have fuel, parts, tracks, intelligence, and above all, replacement. Later in the day, when the beaches were already in Allied hands and the hills were beginning to be climbed, an officer of the 352nd Infantry Division wrote a note with a short sentence: "We fought in the dark." He was not referring to the night. He was referring to the absolute emptiness above their heads. But that void was about to be filled by something even more unexpected, because from the sky now, it wasn't just bombings. Gliders came, and with them a new generation of soldiers, silent, fast, and with a single goal: to collapse the interior of the German defense in a matter of hours. The first shots of the morning at Omaha had been firm, accurate, effective, but by noon, the sound of German machine guns was no longer constant. They were spaced bursts, followed by long silences. It was not a strategy, it was scarcity. What the defenders had not foreseen or had not admitted was that the arithmetic of the ammunition would become their sentence. The doctrine of total defense predicted that coastal positions would withstand 3 days of intense fighting before they needed reinforcements. But the reality of D-Day destroyed that prediction before the first sunset. In WN64, for example, the original stock of mortar grenades, 420 units, was sold out in less than 2 hours. In WN61, the average ammunition per machine gun was sufficient for 8,000 rounds. At 10:45 a.m., rationing was already being done, 1 short burst per minute. The most common scene in the fortifications was no longer the gunshot, but the shouts, "Munition! Munition!" Attempts to resupply became suicidal. Trucks sent from the rear were destroyed by Allied planes before they even crossed 10 kilometers. Freight trains stalled after the tracks were bombed. Improvised vehicles with scarce fuel were abandoned. Everything that should have arrived was not enough, and what was in the coastal deposits evaporated with each gust. Meanwhile, the Americans set up a logistical spectacle. In just 24 hours, 15,000 tons of supplies were landed on the beaches of Normandy, the equivalent of a medium-sized city being set up under fire. Each LST unloaded not only soldiers, but boxes, barrels, pallets, vehicles, radios, groceries, gasoline, antibiotics, tents, telegraphs. The beach was transformed into a warehouse, and everything was accounted for, documented, redistributed in real time by quartermaster officers. The comparison between the two sides becomes even more brutal when one observes the origin of this ability. The United States that year had manufactured 2.4 million tons of ammunition. Germany just over 600,000, a difference of 4 times. But more than the production itself, what decided the war was the ability to take this material to the exact point of combat. The Luftwaffe did not fly. The Reichsbahn was paralyzed. French roads were under constant surveillance by P-47 fighters. The German logistical system had been designed for short wars, quick offensives, and not to sustain a prolonged defense against an enemy replenishing on the beach. And if this statistic was still not enough to reveal the brutal mismatch between the two worlds, write down this number. While the Germans counted the last bullets in their bunkers, the Allies had more than 11 million liters of fuel already landed on D-Day and in the following days. If this data shocked you, write in the comments, "Shocking data." Because it was this fuel that kept the columns of tanks, the command jeeps, the power generators, and even the ovens in the mobile kitchens in full operation, while the German soldiers, hungry and surrounded, burned paper to boil water. The bankruptcy of the German rear was more than material. It was psychological. As commanders realized that their calls for help would not be answered, discipline began to crumble. Entire troops disappeared from the command system, surrendering in small groups or retreating inland without authorization. Phone lines were cut, the radios silenced by Allied interference. When a garrison was cornered, there was no reinforcement. When the ammunition ran out, there was no replacement. Modern war, as Eisenhower said, is won by those who can keep up the fight after the first wave. And the United States had prepared to fight indefinitely. They didn't just transport soldiers. They transported an entire country, a country that has crossed the ocean with everything necessary to rebuild, resupply, and remain. That was the real difference. Courage was on both sides. Sacrifice, too. But on one side, she died with the last bullet. On the other, it was supported with mathematical precision. And all this happened before the eyes of those who swore that the Atlantic Wall was impassable. An officer of the 352nd Division, in a letter seized days later, wrote, "We counted the bullets. They counted the ships." But what those men surrounded in their bunkers didn't yet know is that the ships were just the beginning, because at the heart of Operation Overlord was something even more unlikely, ports that floated. The first symptom was not silence, but echo. As the morning wore on, and the Americans consolidated beachheads in Omaha and Utah, German units began to notice something abnormal. Their distress calls returned as noise or did not return at all. The radio that was once a channel of orders has become a graveyard of static frequencies. The underground telephone lines, carefully laid by Reich engineers, were now cut by bombing, sabotage by the French resistance, and even accidental destruction caused by the retreating defenders themselves. The command posts of the 716th and 352nd Infantry Divisions, key pieces in the Normandy sector, were hit in the first hours by precision airstrikes, operated by P-47s with coordinates transmitted in real time. In less than 6 hours, the German command structure in the region had ceased to exist as a functional network. The divisions began to operate as isolated cells, not knowing where his neighboring units were, not knowing if the flank still resisted, not knowing if there was any chance of a counterattack. A platoon held out in a stone house, while the battalion next door had already retreated 3 kilometers. A machine gun position fired without knowing if it was the last one in operation or if there was still a line behind it. General Marx, commander of the 84th Army Corps, would be mortally wounded in the late afternoon as he tried to reach an advanced position on roads that were already under enemy control. In this command vacuum, what took over was unpredictability. The battles began to multiply like out-of-control bonfires, each with its own logic. A field, a village, an intersection became centers of improvised resistance, with junior officers making decisions that would have been unimaginable before. It was the antithesis of the German doctrine, based on vertical coordination, centralized discipline, and sequential execution. Now each squad fought for itself, with falling ammunition, crumbling morale, and no view of the big picture. By this time, Allied reinforcements weren't just advancing, they were flying. At 9 p.m. on June 6th, Operation Mallard was activated. British Horsa and American CG-4A gliders began to cut through the Norman evening sky. Silent, accurate, and heavy, they carried light artillery, jeeps, field radios, ammunition, and entire troops directly into the interior of the German line. The Luftwaffe, already absent during the day, was completely inoperative by nightfall. Not even reconnaissance missions were launched. Contrary to what the German manuals predicted, the Allied advance did not lose pace at night. On the contrary, the night was used to consolidate, reposition, reinforce, and encircle. Each glider that successfully landed carried the ability to keep the offensive alive. Allied engineers set up makeshift landing zones, highlighting chemical lights and panels to guide pilots in the dark. It was a closed, integrated system, where every part, human or mechanical, knew its function. On the other side, German officers traveled secondary routes on foot, trying to reconnect sectors with messengers, cyclists, even liberated prisoners. The technological modernity of the Reich, which had so fascinated the world in previous years, now seemed archaic in the face of Allied elasticity. What was once discipline has become rigidity. What was once organization has become paralysis. Colonel Goth, sectoral defender of Vierville-sur-Mer, would note in his diary, "We are tactically dead. The radio doesn't speak. The phone does not answer. Artillery fires where there are no more enemies. And the planes, they are not ours." This collapse of the command network was not a coincidence. It was the direct effect of the Allied strategy of disorganizing the rearguard even before consolidating the advance. The paratroopers dropped in the first hours, the sabotage by the French, the bombardments on logistical nodes. It was all part of a larger design, disintegrate the brain before it reached the body. And while the German generals lost touch with their divisions, the Allies connected everything: beach, sky, interior, artillery, infantry, engineering, and logistics, like a living network that grew by the hour, an army that communicated faster, repositioned faster, and above all resupplied faster. The radio that for the Germans became silence, for the Americans became a weapon. By late evening, as the first German prisoners were rounded up by Allied infantry detachments, a statistic was spreading among American intelligence officers. More than 60% of the intercepted reports indicated German units without contact with their higher command, and this number would not stop growing, because the next day, the Allies would land something Germany never thought possible: a full port, and not a port taken, but a port built. By the evening of June 6th, when the Normandy coast was already a maze of isolated fighting and fragmented German units, one name still carried hope in the high command: 21st Panzer Division. It was the only relevant armored force in the immediate vicinity of the beach. Their Panzer IV tanks and their self-propelled guns were, in theory, the perfect answer to crush the Allies before they consolidated their beachheads. But the 21st Division did not move in the morning, not out of cowardice, but out of bureaucracy. The German command in France was locked between divergent orders from Rundstedt and Rommel, both subordinate to Hitler, who required personal authorization to move panzer forces. The authorization only came at noon, when the landings had already been successful. The division departed Caen, advancing along the roads under constant air threat, without air cover, and without coordination with the units that were being destroyed on the coast. At 4 p.m., Its first elements encountered the unexpected: open fields littered with wrecked gliders, still-hot ammunition boxes, and British paratroopers deployed as regular infantry. The landing zones of Operations Mallard and Tonga were defended by forces that were not supposed to be there according to German maps. The advance of the 21st Division turned into a growing confusion. The tanks, designed for rapid advance in open territory, entered partially urban areas among ruins, hedgerows, and minefields. At 6:20 p.m., when they finally reached the vicinity of Sword Beach, a surreal scenario awaited. Not a disorganized beach, but a makeshift port in operation. Jeeps traveled on floating walkways. Troops landed in coordinated blocks. Allied planes flew over with total freedom. When the German tanks attempted to open fire, they were immediately illuminated by flares dropped by forward observers. Within seconds, the English Channel shone, and with it, the silhouettes of the panzers. The counterpunch would become a massacre. Allied gunboats opened fire with anti-tank ammunition. P-47 fighters appeared in dives with high-penetration rockets. In less than an hour, 40 armored vehicles were destroyed. The survivors tried to retreat, but found the roads already congested with debris, craters, and British defense positions established between the villages. The division was not only repelled, she was humiliated, and the most ironic, at the end of the night, part of its remnants found shelter north of Caen, at the same point from which they had departed. The only room that reached the beach retreated, not because he lacked courage, but because the whole plan had been designed for a type of war that no longer existed. General Edgar Feuchtinger, commander of the 21st, would later write, "Our tanks were ready for lightning, but the war was now made up of fixed steel, radio networks, and supply satellites." With the failure of the armored counterattack, Germany's last strategic card in Normandy had been played and burned. There would be no other advance, no broken flank, no reconquest. Just wait. But what the Germans did not yet know is that this wait would not lead to a negotiation, nor to a ceasefire. It would lead to the arrival of a logistical artifact that seemed like legend, the floating ports. What was left of the German defensive line at Golden Juno tried to hold out with everything it still had: field artillery, pillboxes, machine gun nests, and anti-tank devices hidden under the sand. They expected conventional armor, ordinary Shermans, heavy Churchill tanks they already knew, with weaknesses and predictable behavior. But what emerged among the mist of the waves did not seem to have come out of the Wehrmacht's manuals. It was as if an army of engineers had rewritten the war the day before. The first visual impact was caused by the crocodile tanks, British modifications of the Churchill that carried flamethrowers with a range of more than 100 meters, capable of incinerating fortified positions without the need for approach. When the jet of fire emerged, breaking through trenches and spreading panic in concrete bunkers, the defenders did not know whether to shoot or ran. Behind them came the Crab, modified Sherman tanks with large rotating cylinders, equipped with steel chains that whipped the ground to detonate mines. These vehicles cleared paths through the minefields as if ploughing the earth, opening safe corridors for the infantry. Some German soldiers thought they were chemical weapons, such was the strangeness. Rommel's doctrine, centered on fixed obstacles, simply did not have a technical answer to this mechanical flexibility. And then there were the aviari, armored vehicles equipped with 290mm mortars, nicknamed petard, used to destroy fortifications with almost point-blank fire. Each shot tore off entire walls of reinforced concrete. These tanks also carried folding bridges, extendable tracks, and steamrollers to allow crossing of ditches and craters under fire. What was supposed to be a lethal maze of traps and barriers became a passable path in minutes. These machines had not been improvised on the battlefield. They had been conceived in the previous months by the team of British General Percy Hobart, who had been ridiculed years earlier for his unorthodox ideas of adapting armor. Called the Hobart Entertainers by the press and even by Allied officials, these vehicles now turned beaches into safe passages. An engineer's imagination, ignored by traditional warfare theorists, had outgrown an entire fortification doctrine that took years to build. And that was the real amazement. The Germans were not just facing tanks, but a mentality of continuous adaptation. The Allies did not bring solutions to the past. They anticipated future problems and came up with the answer before the question was asked. In each sector of the beach, there was a specific machine to break through exactly that type of obstacle. It was a war by catalogue, mass-produced, field-tested, lab-honed. From the German point of view, this created a demoralizing psychological effect. How to defend a beach if each trap was nullified with a specific tool? How to trust static barriers when the enemy simply dismantled them in real time? Private Hans Trippel, mortar operator of the 726th Division, would write years later, "With every solution of ours they had a tank that nullified. It was like fighting an instruction manual." This ingenious approach reflected not only a technological superiority, but a cultural one. While the German command valued rigidity and excellence in closed structures, the Allies operated on the principle of adaptation to scale. It wasn't about having the best tank, it was about having the right tank, at the right time, in sufficient quantity to break the deadlock. The irony is that this engineering revolution was not born in secret laboratories, but in public factories, university workshops, and civic centers. The war in the United States and Britain had become a collective effort of continuous innovation. With each simulated landing, a new fault was identified. With each simulation, a new solution emerged. In 12 months, more than 20 different models of specialized armored vehicles were created for Operation Overlord alone. No army in history had used so much technical design to break through so much reinforced concrete. And if all this already seems surprising, consider this fact. In the first 2 days of the invasion, 259 units of these special tanks were landed. On some beaches, the ratio was 1 specialized vehicle for every 2 conventional armored vehicles. A custom-made force like a steel scalpel against a wall that was waiting for sledgehammers. The German fortifications, even when intact, were overtaken by flanks opened by machines that no one expected. And positions that withstood direct fire were surrounded, isolated and reduced by the precision of tools, not brute force. An Allied engineer, interviewed years later, would define the spirit of the operation in one sentence: "Where they saw obstacles, we saw function." That was the real watershed. It was not a question of beating the Germans in the arm, it was about conquering his imagination, and that's what the machines did. They silenced the machine guns with continuous fire. They swept the mines with spinning chains. They knocked down the bunkers with articulated steel tubes. But all this innovation was only possible because behind each vehicle there was a port, and not a conquered port, but a port set up, floating, repositionable, capable of delivering 1,000 tons per hour. And these ports were already on their way. On the ground, the German defenders were already under constant pressure. But it was in the sky that the real psychological terror emerged, a kind of war they simply weren't prepared to face. From the early hours of D-Day, as the coastline was taken over by amphibious landings and radios were muted under bombardment and sabotage, another front of combat opened quietly above them. The British 6th Airborne Division to the east and the American 82nd and 101st Divisions to the west not only fell behind enemy lines, they spread like a virus. Their targets were bridges, roads, strategic villages and communication nodes, but its effects went beyond the military plane. With each new report that reached the German garrisons, paratroopers seen in the forest, suspicious movement in the hills, gunfire from the rear, the sense of encirclement grew. The feeling was that the enemy was everywhere, invisible, omnipresent. A report from the Wehrmacht's 91st Infantry Division records that at around 4 a.m., entire units stopped moving for fear of ambushes from the sky. Troops entrenched in Carentan opened fire on Allies mistaken for invaders, and in several regions, German detachments exchanged fire with each other, triggering imaginary ambushes. The Allied airborne operation was not only bold, it was disproportionate. More than 13,000 men dropped in one night, supported by more than 2,000 transport aircraft. What's more, thousands of ragdolls, the famous Rupert, were thrown as distractions, causing the Germans to fire their best anti-aircraft resources at false targets. One of the British paratroopers would later recall, "They didn't know where we were, so they shot everywhere." The real advantage of this vertical warfare was not just positioning, it was disorganization. The paratroopers were not alone. They brought with them long-range radios, engineers, sabotage equipment, snipers, and maps with coordinates that allowed them to guide bombings with millimeter precision. They didn't just fight, they guided the war in real time. While the Luftwaffe remained absent and ground communications collapsed, American airborne forces controlled the night. If the Germans moved, they were seen. If they stood still, they were surrounded. An officer of the 709th Division, in a seized diary, wrote, "We were attacked backwards. Every time we turned, they were already behind again. It was a type of war that German textbooks did not foresee, because it wasn't just war, it was ubiquity. And behind it all again was the industry. The United States alone had produced 9,400 CG-4A gliders during the war, while Germany never exceeded a few hundred. For every American transport plane in use in Normandy, the Germans had a fraction without fuel or trained pilots. The ratio of airborne capacity between the two sides was nearly 20-1. If this surprised you, write in the comments, "Logistics wins," because it was this air imbalance, the result of mass production and detailed planning, that turned the Normandy sky into a one-sided battlefield, a total dominion where the enemy fell from the sky, multiplied on the ground, and disappeared into the darkness before the answer. In a single night, the 82nd and 101st Divisions cut 9 roads, 5 railroad lines, and destroyed 4 critical bridges. There was no German division capable of moving without facing ambushes, blockades, or improvised explosive devices, and all this even before dawn. On the ground, Wehrmacht soldiers were still trying to understand what was happening. On the maps of their portfolios, that region was safe, it was rearguard. But what they saw on the field were moving shadows, radios sizzling in English, and gunfire coming from illogical directions. The geography of the war had been reversed. What was static has become mobile, what was safe has become vulnerable, and it was in this three-dimensional war scenario, where the ground, sky, and rear were controlled by the enemy, that the Allied engineers activated their final trump card. On the horizon, metal blocks began to float and connect like pieces of a puzzle. Entire ports with docks, cranes, and road accesses, built not on Earth, but over the sea. The first days after landing should be the most fragile. According to German doctrine, an invading force that did not conquer a port would soon be doomed to logistical collapse. But the Allies didn't come to conquer ports, they came to build them, and they did it on the waves. In just 36 hours, structures began to appear on the beaches of Normandy that seemed impossible, floating piers of steel and concrete, connected by movable bridges that stretched from sea to land like the articulated arms of an industrial creature. They were the mulberries, artificial ports, prefabricated in England, towed by more than 30 tugs, and mounted under fire. An engineering miracle that the Germans had not foreseen, not even in their most alarmist reports. These structures had everything: landing docks, mobile breakwaters, wave-damping systems, cranes, fuel depots. Each Mulberry port could unload up to 7,000 tons per day. For comparison, a conventional German port on the Atlantic, such as Lorient, operated at lower capacity and took decades to build. While Wehrmacht soldiers tried to repel the landings with what was left of ammunition and communications, the Americans and British literally set up a city. An entire logistics system was activated right there on the beach. Canvas roads, mobile pipelines, field hospitals, industrial kitchens, and even makeshift movie theaters emerged among the wreckage. What to the Germans seemed like the chaos of the landing was actually concentrated order, a millimetrically planned operation, executed with assembly line precision. The coastal artillery that was still functioning tried to aim at the convoys. But each attack was predicted, triangulated, retaliated. Reconnaissance planes even mapped the movement of shadows, and when the batteries fired, the response came from sky, sea, and land. The feeling of helplessness became routine. A German commander would report, "It was not an attack, it was a factory setting up." Most disturbing to German observers was the constancy. Each dawn brought new ships, new cargoes, new divisions. Instead of reducing, the flow increased. It was as if the sea was being converted into a road. By the third day of the invasion, the Allies had landed more than 170,000 men, 20,000 vehicles, and 40,000 tons of supplies. Never in military history had an invading force grown so large in such a short time. The resistance, once glorified in the speeches of the High Command, now seemed futile. Each retaken position was bombed with precision. Every troop movement was intercepted by fighter jets or ambushed by paratroopers who were still active. Maneuver warfare, a pillar of German strategic thinking, had no more space. The front was static, but not for the Allies. For them, it was a conveyor belt for supply. And all this was only possible because of a factor rarely celebrated in heroic narratives: planning. D-Day began to be prepared 2 years earlier. Every quay, every bay, every sea current has been studied by hydrologists, engineers, and civil architects. What the Germans saw as improvisation was actually the pinnacle of modern logistical coordination, and behind this feat again were the factories. In the US alone, 1.5 million tons of materials were allocated exclusively for the construction of mulberries. More than 600,000 men were involved in the logistical operation of the invasion. Non-soldiers, engineers, operators, drivers, analysts, mathematicians, an invisible force that did not shoot, but he won. Rommel, who had warned so much about the need to contain the Allies on the beaches, now watched his prediction come true in reverse. Instead of being pushed back into the sea, the invaders had turned the sea into solid ground. When asked about the progress of the invasion, one of Rundstedt's general staff officers replied with resignation, "It is no longer a landing. It's a continent that has arrived." And if all this already seemed like the apex of Allied power, there was more. Because while the floating ports turned beaches into cities, undersea pipelines were already on their way. The SS Division Das Reich was the armored pride of the Third Reich. Veteran of the Eastern Front, trained to exhaustion, equipped with heavy tanks, self-propelled artillery, and rapid reconnaissance vehicles. In theory, it was the perfect reaction force to crush any Allied beachhead that formed in Normandy. His mission, received on June 6th, was clear: to move from Montauban in the south of France to Caen, where it was believed that the bulk of the British offensive would consolidate. The total distance was about 700 kilometers, a forced march that, with logistical priority and operational freedom, could be completed in 3 days. But German theory did not count on the real France. The path became a trap, with each bridge blown up by the French resistance, with each sabotaged tunnel, with each ambush on the rural roads. The minutes turned into hours. The RAF, aware of the displacement, maintained constant aerial surveillance. Entire columns were destroyed while still in motion. Fuel cars burned in forced traffic jams. Armored vehicles turned into flames even before engaging the first gear against the enemy. In several sections, soldiers were forced to abandon heavy vehicles and continue on foot, exposed, delayed, without air cover. When they finally reached the theater of operations, 17 days had passed. A displacement that was supposed to mark the counter-offensive had become a parade of defeat. What's more, the division was no longer the same. About 30% of their vehicles had been destroyed or abandoned. Hundreds of soldiers were missing, dead or wounded. Morale, once a symbol of the German war machine, was now diluted in exhaustion and frustration. An officer of Das Reich would write in his diary, "We marched into battle as if we were ghosts, but what awaited us was not glory. It was bombed asphalt." This episode reveals a fundamental strategic turn. The war was no longer won by the speed of attack, but by the ability to deny mobility to the enemy. And in this, the Allies were perfect. The French resistance, with information provided by radio and instructions printed on leaflets, dropped from planes, destroyed more than 1,800 kilometers of railroad tracks in the first week of the invasion. Bridges were ruined with loads concentrated in structural points. Roads were blocked with downed trees and vehicles set on fire. Each stopped truck became a target. The Luftwaffe, which could have offered rescue air cover, simply no longer existed in real capacity. Allied air superiority wasn't just numerical. It was constant, absolute, ubiquitous. Reconnaissance planes mapped movements. Fighters carried out attacks of opportunity. Bombers interrupted logistical concentrations with precision. Heaven belonged to an aluminum and kerosene industry that did not stop producing. The Wehrmacht, which had been so proud of the Blitzkrieg, now lived its negation, the stopped war, and not by choice, but due to incapacity. The major offensives, once marked by synchrony and quick maneuvers, have given way to waits at destroyed intersections, attempts to repair bridges with makeshift materials, and nocturnal walks with no clear direction. The concept of time, fundamental in German operational doctrine, was hijacked by Allied logistics. And there is one fact that shows this with brutal clarity. While the Das Reich division covered its 700 kilometers in 17 days, the Allies, on the other end of the line, landed about 20,000 tons of supplies per day, a moving machine facing a bottled army. If this data impresses you, comment Blitzkrieg bankruptcy, because that was the silent truth of the invasion. It was not just a victory of arms, but of movement. The dominance of time, space, and infrastructure was what broke the backbone of German reaction. Every minute of delay wasn't just wasted time, it was a given advantage. The Wehrmacht's elite arrived on the battlefield late, mutilated and functionless. The war for them had already ended before it even began. But even with this collapse of mobility, there was a point on the map that still resisted. An urban stronghold where the battle would turn into a street-by-street hell. The name of this place was Caen, Villers-Bocage, June 13, 1944. The streets of the small French town witnessed one of the most legendary engagements of the Normandy campaign. There, SS Hauptsturmführer Mikkel Wittmann, commander of an elite Panzer Tiger I, executed a maneuver that would go down in the annals of armored tactics. In less than 15 minutes, it destroyed an entire column of British vehicles, 14 tanks, 15 transport vehicles, 2 self-propelled guns, a feat that German newsreels immediately turned into a symbol of resistance, courage, and technical superiority. The image of Wittmann next to his Tiger became a stamp, a headline, a morale. But what did not appear in the pamphlets was the practical consequence. While the ashes of the Shermans were still smoking in the streets, new British units were already organizing to replace them. For every tank lost, there were 2 in reserve, and for every Tiger shot down, the Reich took weeks to send another, when it still had parts, fuel, or pilots available. Wittmann, in fact, was a genius of the battlefield, but even geniuses bleed before mathematics. A single Tiger like his consumed 3 times as much fuel as a Sherman, though it needed specific parts, experienced drivers, and constant infantry escort. It was a lethal weapon and too expensive. The British and Americans, on the other hand, treated tanks as cogs in a cog. They were mass-produced with a simplified design, standardized maintenance, and immediate readiness. The battlefield has become a laboratory of repetition. With each German tactical victory, the strategic cost increased. Wittmann survived the fighting, but his Tiger would be destroyed weeks later by an air counterattack. He died inside the machine that propaganda called indestructible, hit by an Allied fighter bomber. It wasn't a duel of tanks, it was more of an equation: air supremacy plus field intelligence, total neutralization. The irony of this story is that the solution was in front of them. Modern warfare no longer rewarded the lone hero, but rather the system. Mass production, efficient logistics, interoperability between units. It no longer mattered only how much was destroyed, but how much could be replaced. Wittmann destroyed dozens of vehicles, but those vehicles have come back, and he hasn't. If you're enjoying unraveling the technical backstage of the war and understanding what really defined the battles, show your support. Like and subscribe so we can bring you more in-depth content based on real data, maps, and documents, because Villers-Bocage was no exception. It was the portrait of a pattern, where each German glow was followed by an even larger Allied shadow. While British tanks reappeared on the roads the next day, the factory that produced Wittmann's Tiger was being bombed. And even in the face of this reality, German commanders still believed they could hold back the advance. But what would come next was not just armored superiority, it was the victory of information. On July 25, 1944, the skies over Normandy ceased to be just airspace. They became a sentence. At 9:38 a.m., more than 1,500 heavy bombers, B-17 Flying Fortress and B-24 Liberator, opened their floodgates over a narrow strip of German-held terrain west of St. Lo. In less than 3 hours, more than 4,000 tons of bombs fell on an area of less than 7 square kilometers. It was the beginning of Operation Cobra, and its goal was not simply to open a breach, it was to vaporize the resistance. The storm of explosives was so dense that an American general, Leslie McNair, died when he was hit by friendly fire, even though he was miles from the enemy line. The impact was felt not only on the ground, but in the souls of the men who trampled on it. German soldiers, who had already been suffocated by weeks of tactical bombing and nights of air terror, now faced something different. The bombs did not come in sorties. They came en masse, in blocks, in waves. Senses were lost. The ground shook as if the world was falling apart. Trees flew like toothpicks. Tanks were tossed aside like toys. And inside the trenches, the men no longer fought. They just waited. A commander of the German 275th Division would later write, "They are no longer soldiers. They are broken men." This phrase defines the new kind of dominance that the Allies imposed on the Wehrmacht. It wasn't just artillery fire. It was psychological warfare, sensory warfare, total war. It was the physical translation of the difference between a country that produced 300 bombers a month and another that could no longer resupply its own artillery. Operation Cobra revealed that the war had already moved beyond the realm of tactics and invaded that of perception. The sound of the air engines, the sight of formations streaking across the sky like steel colonies, the simple fact that the enemy could choose the time and place of destruction, all this tore German morale more than any ambush or siege. And behind every ton released was a system. Factories that produced, railroads that delivered, fuel tanks that fueled, weather units that calculated the wind, cryptographs that protected the planes. Germany, which had invested so much in doctrine and individual genius, was now the victim of an enemy that standardized to destruction. In certain sectors, after the bombing, German soldiers simply abandoned their positions. Some walked towards the Allied lines with makeshift white flags. Others dug graves in the middle of the craters, certain that the next wave would hit them. Officers shouted orders that no one else heard. The sound had become white noise. The soil, pulverized, made it impossible to distinguish road from field, tank from debris. The artillery that the Wehrmacht still had left had no range. The radios were muted or interfered with. And the reinforcement, it didn't come. Rail lines had been destroyed, roads dominated by P-47 fighters, and the trucks that were still running had no fuel. It was the end, but an end that came from above. And even in the face of this calculated apocalypse, the German command still resisted admitting defeat. The propaganda spoke of tactical retreat, of strategic resistance, of planned counterattacks. But the soldiers in the craters knew. They knew they were fighting against something that could not be killed, only waited, because the enemy now had no face. It was the roar of the engines, the glow of aluminum in the sky, the trembling in my stomach before the explosion. It was a force that could not be outflanked, overcome, or surprised. It was the definitive symbol of the industrial age applied to war. And while the wreckage still burned in St. Lo, another symbol of supremacy loomed, not in the air, but under the sea. A project that the Germans considered impossible, to send fuel directly from England under the English Channel. The name of the project? Pluto, August 1944. The German army in Normandy was no longer fighting to win, it was fighting to escape. After weeks of unsuccessful attempts to contain the Allied advance, the High Command ordered the withdrawal. The hope was to cross the valley between Falaise, Chambois, and Argentan before the Allies closed in on the siege. But what was formed there was not an escape route. It was a funnel, a narrow exposed corridor surrounded by armored divisions, heavy artillery, and total air superiority. In a few days, the so-called Falaise pocket would become a graveyard of steel and flesh. About 50,000 German soldiers were captured. Another 10,000 died. Thousands simply disappeared into the mud. The roads, seen from the air, looked like black rivers, not of water, but of tank carcasses, burned trucks, blown horses, abandoned boots. The Americans closed the ring from the south. The Canadians and Poles came from the north. And in between, the German divisions trampled each other in despair. Men marched aimlessly, officers without command, tanks without fuel. Many soldiers tried to escape on foot, dressed in civilian clothes or without any equipment. The escape columns stretched for miles, easy to locate and even easier to destroy. Every air raid was a massacre. The Thunderbolts flew low, launching rockets at vehicles that could not move. The Allied infantry advanced down the flanks, capturing entire platoons that had already thrown away their guns. The scene repeated itself at every point on the road. Overturned armored vehicles, charred jeeps, charred corpses holding steering wheels, melted machine guns stuck to steel shields. Even those who managed to cross to the east were broken, physically and psychologically. Many would not fight again. It was the collapse of not just one position, but of an entire model of war. The Wehrmacht that entered France in June was an army. The one that came out of Falaise was a spectre. Of the 150,000 soldiers originally deployed in Normandy, more than half were neutralized. Of the 400 tanks that Rommel hoped to use in counterattacks, there were a few operational ones left. There were no supplies, there was no replacement, there was no command. What was left of the German war machine was now in the hands of geography, luck, and an enemy that refused to stop. Major Hans von Luck, commander of the 21st Panzer, would later write, "We did not lose at Falaise, we were erased." And he did not exaggerate. At the end of the battle, Canadian engineering teams had to push the corpses with bulldozers to clear the roads. The soil was unsuitable for cultivation for years, and the memory of what happened there became a symbol, not of a battle, but of an operational extinction. because what was seen in the pocket was not a formal surrender. It was the spontaneous dissolution of an armed force that had ignored all signs. Who believed in the invincibility of doctrine, in the superiority of the race, in the permanence of the Reich, but none of this has withstood the gears of American production, British precision, Canadian fury, Polish encirclement. The very idea of blitzkrieg died in Falaise, not by a shot, but due to lack of traction. The terrain became a trap, the sky became a sentence, and the German rear became a pile of scrap metal. But there was still one last symbol to be carved into the soil of Normandy. Because while German trucks were destroyed by the thousands, the Allies were building a secret pipeline under the English Channel, which would soon supply their tanks direct from England. The name of this project? Pluto. And he would turn the Allied advance into something the Germans could no longer halt. Heinrich So survived, but contrary to what the letter in the pocket of his uniform in Omaha predicted, he did not return as a hero. He returned like a broken man, not by the explosion of a howitzer or by a well-aimed shot, but by the revelation that his 13,500 shots had prevented absolutely nothing. Years later, sitting in a machine shop in the Bavarian countryside, he would confess to a French journalist, "I shot as they were told, but it was like trying to stop the ocean with a shovel. The war didn't just defeat his army, it undid his identity. What the Hitler Youth instructors had taught him, what his superiors had reinforced, what his flag proclaimed, all had been buried under Allied concrete, naval steel, and supply barracks. The belief in racial superiority, the doctrine of the perfect offensive, the pride of a nation called to lead the world, everything turned to silence in front of ships that set up ports on the high seas, tanks that floated, planes that fell from the sky in thousands. It wasn't just so. Thousands of soldiers who survived Normandy returned to a ruined Germany, physical and ideological. Some wrote books, trying to understand how they had believed so much. Others founded schools, became pacifists, religious or downright skeptics. A former panzer officer became a civil bridge engineer and told his students, "The only battle worth fighting is the one that builds something that will stay standing." The defeat, for them, was not the retreat at Falaise, nor the loss of positions. It was the discovery that their sacrifices were made in the name of a logistical delirium, of a worldview that ignored the reality of industry, mathematics, and morals. The Wehrmacht was disbanded on the field, but the spirit of the German soldier was shattered in memory. There was no more honor to defend. Those who saw the enormity of the invasion knew that they had been sent into the field with bravery and no chance. They knew that they were not just facing men, but a system, and that this system had won not by superiority of courage, but of vision. Because the enemy did not believe in race, he believed in tonnage. He did not pray for a 1,000-year empire. He planned the logistics for next Tuesday. He did not teach discipline for punishment. It produced uniforms tailored to each body. The moral defeat was silent but devastating. Soldiers who once shouted Sieg Heil in parades now taught their children that nothing, absolutely nothing, is worth a war. What seemed impossible in 1940 became evident in 1944. An empire that underestimates reason, he will be crushed by it. And in the midst of this collapse, a final truth began to emerge, a truth that was not written by generals, but by crane operators, anonymous sailors and civil engineers, an invisible line built under the sea, capable of supplying the entire front without a single German truck intercepting it. The name was Pluto, and its inauguration would forever change the concept of total war. D-Day, in the eyes of those on the wrong side of the beach, was not just the loss of a battle, it was the implosion of an entire doctrine. Nazi Germany, molded in myths of purity, heroism, and unerring command, believed that discipline and will would be enough to contain the advance of materialistic nations. But on that June 6th, and in the days that followed, they discovered that the real power came not from the shout of the sergeant, but from the silence of the cranes. That it was not courage that won a war, but the fuel that moved the tank, the pontoon bridge that crossed the channel, the radio that was not intercepted. The collapse of the Wehrmacht in Normandy was not just physical, it was moral, doctrinal, structural. Every soldier surrendered, every armored vehicle burned, every general with no radio signal was a comma in a much larger report, the final report of the obsolescence of a worldview, because the 20th century exchanged the hero with the sword for the worker in overalls. The victory did not belong to the fiercest, It belonged to the most supplied. This is the final lesson of D-Day from a German perspective. Logistics determines strategy. Volume supplants precision. The factory wins the front. Ultimately, no doctrine survives starvation, the lack of ammunition, the absence of fuel. Modern warfare is fought long before the firing. It is won or lost in ports, on assembly lines, on supply routes. That is why American generals flew over the beaches with logistical maps, while the Germans called for reinforcements by silent radios. Who said this with brutal honesty was General Alfred Jodl, condemned at Nuremberg. We were not defeated by the courage of the Allies. We were crushed by their trucks. This confession sums up the bitter tone of a generation that bet everything on brute force and lost to continuous force. If you believe that the story needs to be told with facts, context, and respect for the truth, leave your like and subscribe now. This helps us to continue bringing deep research like this. And comment, what was the most shocking data you discovered today? Ring the bell, the next historical fact may change your worldview. Don't go away yet. Listen to the next true story that will appear on the screen. Always remember, logistics determines strategy. Watch the next video here on the channel with another incredible story.